Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website weather.gov/Alaska, get any updates to your forecast, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391, get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at our satellite imagery. We have several different lows moving through the area. One is out over the western portion of the Bering that's moving towards the central portions of the Bering Sea. You can see some of the cloud cover extending out over the Pribilof Islands from that low. We have another low out by the northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, pretty weak, but still bringing some showers to areas around the Gulf and along the North Gulf Coast. We have another stronger system that you can see on satellite in the very bottom left-hand corner of our screen, bringing some cloud cover closer towards the western Aleutian Islands as this system comes up, bringing quite a bit of moisture and some stronger winds with it. And then finally, we'll look up along the Arctic coastline where we can see some showers coming in the northwest flow associated with a trough that's pushing through the area. So as we look now at the remainder of today's weather, quite a bit of activity going on. However, none of that is extensively strong except for that system coming up from the North Pacific towards the Aleutian Islands. That system is going to bring some heavier rain, but not quite there for the remainder of today, where we'll just see some lighter rain for the Aleutian Islands. The low out over the Bering Sea is pushing its trough and some rain towards the Pribilof Islands as well as the eastern Aleutians, and then some lighter rain out by the Alaska Peninsula. As we move up the west coast of the state, we'll start to see a mix of rain and snow as we make it to the YK Delta area. That's going to become more snow as we move further to the north and further inland. As we move up the west coast, continuing to see more snow, and that snow is going to continue along the North Slope area, or along the Arctic coastline we'll see that snow mix with fog as that trough is moving in. And note behind that we are going to see that northwest flow, and that's going to continue for the most part for several more days. Into Saturday, we do expect areas of elevated surf along the Chukchi Sea coastline from that northwest flow. Over the interior, we have high pressure dominating the area. However, there is some stratus under there that is allowing for some snow in the southeastern portions of the interior. Low pressure out over the northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing some snow to the eastern portions of South Central, as well as the coastal mountains along the North Gulf Coast. There's going to be some areas of fog lingering around the northern portions of Cook Inlet, as well as in the Anchorage area. And then as we move further to the east, we are going to see some lighter showers throughout the Panhandle area, with some snow as we get further to the north. As we move into tonight, pretty similar for the Panhandle area. We'll see more showers of rain in the central locations and places nearest to the Gulf of Alaska. But as we move further inland and farther to the north, we are going to see more snow. Some snow lingering around the eastern portions of South Central area, especially in Wrangell, St. Elias area. And then we'll still have some fog overnight tonight in the northern portions of Cook Inlet that does extend into the Anchorage area. High pressure continuing to dominate the interior, keeping most of the area dry until we get up into the Brooks Range where we'll see some more snow, and we'll see some areas of fog along the eastern portions of the Arctic coast. The trough pushing through the west coast or northwest coast of the state is going to bring more snow to the area that's going to extend down into the Kotzebue Sound area and some areas of the Norton Sound. Down in the Kuskokwim Delta area, we'll see some areas of fog developing overnight. And then as we look further to the south, we'll see our system coming up from the North Pacific, bringing heavier rain and some stronger winds to the Aleutian Islands, as well as into the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands, with some lighter rain out ahead of this system out by the Alaska Peninsula. As we look into Thursday, that system is going to push further to the east, bringing more rain to the Aleutian Islands, extending out through much of the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands, as well as now far enough east to cover much of the Alaska Peninsula. Up the coastline, a little bit drier until we get to the Norton Sound area where we'll see some snow that's going to continue up the west coast and along the Arctic coastline where eastern locations will be a mix of snow and fog. The high pressure is still continuing to keep the interior relatively dry on Thursday, but as we drop down into the eastern portions of South Central Alaska, we will see some of the showers lingering over the mountains and along the North Gulf Coast. For much of the interior, we'll see some drying, but as we get to the northern locations, there will still be some precipitation, starting to get to be more snow in areas further to the north. And then in the very southern portions of the Panhandle, we will see some rain from a system out to the southeast of the Gulf of Alaska. As we move into Friday, our main system is now pushed closer towards the eastern Aleutian Islands, extending its front now through the Gulf of Alaska. This is going to bring rain to areas throughout the Aleutian Islands with some snow at the higher elevations. That's going to be true for Kodiak Island as well. Much of this rain will not make it to south central Alaska on Friday. However, we will see some rain out ahead of this front for much of the Panhandle area. And once again, at higher elevations and areas farther to the north, we will see that transition over to snow. High pressure still remaining out much of the interior, keeping most of the interior fairly dry except some of the northern and northwestern portions of the interior. We'll see some snow from the Norton Sound area up the west coast and to the western locations of the Arctic coastline. Down through much of the Bering Sea, we'll see a lot more drying conditions on Friday. Taking a look now at our temperatures, our lows for Thursday morning, starting down in the Aleutian Islands, temperatures dropping down into the lower 40s. And then as we move to southwest Alaska, temperatures dropping down into the mid-20s for the most part, colder as we get further inland. Up the west coast, continuing to see those mid-20s for St. Lawrence Island as well as the Seward Peninsula, and up much of the west coast to the Point Hope and Point Lay areas. Up along the Arctic coastline, going to get gradually colder as we move further to the east into the single digits for the eastern North Slope area. Down in the interior, a mixture of single digits and below zero numbers, with the Arctic Village area being the coldest, getting down to -12. As we look down into south central Alaska, temperatures dropping down into the teens in interior locations into the 20s as we get closer towards the water, with some 30s right along the North Gulf Coast area. Then down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down into the mid-30s. As we look into Thursday afternoon highs, we're going to see temperatures rise back up into the mid-40s for the Panhandle area, into the 30s for much of south central Alaska. Again, interior locations going to be a little bit colder, getting up into the 20s there. In interior Alaska, into the teens for many locations, however, staying in the single digits for more northern locations, and in the 20s as we get further to the west. Up along the Arctic coastline, teens out east, and then at 20s as we move further to the west. Down in the Seward Peninsula area, in the lower 30s is expected, and then in the lower to mid-30s for southwest Alaska. Along the Alaska Peninsula into the mid-40s, that's going to continue throughout the Aleutian Islands and the Pribilofs, with St. Paul getting up to 45 degrees. Lows for Friday morning dropping back down to near 40 degrees for the Aleutians, into the lower 20s to upper teens for southwest Alaska, mid-20s for the Seward Peninsula area, and right around 20 degrees for the northwest coast. Single digits for the eastern portions of the Arctic coastline, and then in the interior, once again, single digits to below zero numbers. Some of the coldest areas are going to be further to the north and east. Down in south central Alaska, temperatures dropping down into the 20s, within the teens as we get to the more interior locations. Down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down into the mid-30s. Highs for Friday afternoon, getting back up into the 40s for the southeastern portions of the state. South central Alaska, 20s in the landlocked areas, and then 30s near the water. Up into the interior, single digits and areas out to the east, getting up into the 20s as we go to areas in the western interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, most places will be in the 20s. For the Seward Peninsula area, right around 30 degrees. And then the upper 20s to lower 30s for southwest Alaska, mid-40s for the Alaska Peninsula, as well as the Aleutian Islands, and then the lower 40s for the Pribilof Islands, with St. Paul getting up to 42 degrees.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread MVFR conditions are expected. However, we do also have some IFR moving up towards the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. So look up the west coast of the state, primarily MVFR until we get up by the Kotzebue Sound area, where we'll start to see some IFR conditions as well, and then a mixture of MVFR and IFR along the Arctic coast. Down in the interior, we're also going to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR, and then in south central Alaska, primarily VFR conditions expected, with some more MVFR as we get further to the east. Down in the Panhandle area, central and southern locations going to see MVFR and then IFR as we get further to the north. For Thursday afternoon, going to clear up a little bit in the southern portions of the Panhandle, VFR conditions moving in, and then all the way down to IFR as we move up to the northern locations. South Central primarily VFR once again, then in the interior primarily MVFR for central and western locations, and then in the Yukon Flats area some VFR conditions are expected. VFR conditions for eastern portions of the North Slope, and then down to MVFR as we move to the west. Down the west coast it's going to be primarily MVFR with intermittent VFR conditions expected, and then out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians primarily MVFR with IFR still for the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. As we move into Friday morning, pretty similar pattern for the Bering Sea with MVFR widespread and IFR conditions for the central and eastern Aleutians. Southwest Alaska as well as south central Alaska should be VFR Friday morning. In the interior, primarily MVFR and IFR, as well as out by the Kotzebue Sound area and up along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, southern locations going to see VFR conditions and then dropping all the way down to IFR in the areas farthest to the north. Friday afternoon going to be primarily MVFR for the Panhandle area, VFR for the southern mainland, then down to MVFR for much of the rest of the central and northern portions of the mainland. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, primarily MVFR, however there will be some pockets of VFR conditions by the Pribilof Islands. Taking a look at our basses, starting up north in AKwx, MVFR conditions in the morning, improving to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Adigan Pass will also start off with marginal conditions improving to VFR later in the day, and Lake Clark and Merrill should both be VFR throughout the day on Thursday. Rainy Pass also expected to be VFR. Windy Pass, however, will start off with marginal conditions and then improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Isabel Pass will also start off in VFR, improve to VFR later in the day. Fantastic Pass should be MVFR throughout the day on Thursday. Tenita Pass should be VFR throughout the day on Thursday, as well as at Portage. And then Chilkoot and White should both be down in IFR conditions all day Thursday. Taking a look at our freezing level, surface freezing line goes through the northern portions of the Bering Sea, then down the southwest coastline along the North Gulf Coast, and then into the Panhandle area. We have some areas of warmer air coming in towards the central Aleutian Islands with that system coming up from the south, bringing freezing levels up to as high as 6,000 feet to the central Aleutian Islands with up to as high as 12,000 feet a little bit farther to the south. Out over the Panhandle area, another area where we have some warmer air, up to around 4,000 feet just to the south of the Panhandle. For our icing out over northern portions of the Panhandle area, as well as out towards Yakutat, between 2,000 and 5,000 feet is expected. Along the Chukchi Sea coastline, including the Kotzebue Sound area, below 7,000 feet is expected. And then out by the Aleutian Islands and southern Bering Sea, we do expect to have some icing there above 4,000 feet. Taking a look at our jet stream strongest portion of the jet for the southern areas of the Panhandle, getting up to as high as 130 to 135 knots out of a southwesterly direction. Out over much of this day, we're going to see westerly winds up to as high as around 50 knots, stronger as we get closer towards the Bering Strait area, up to as high as 75 knots out there. And then a jet streak up to as high as 110 knots out of a northwesterly direction out over the Alaska Peninsula. At 9,000 feet, strongest winds are going to be around our low by the central Aleutian Islands, with winds out as high as 50 to 65 knots south of the central Aleutians out of a southwesterly direction. Out over the western and southern Bering Sea out of an easterly direction, 40 knots expected. Out over the Bristol Bay area, northwest winds 25 knots. And then near the Bering Strait area, northwest winds up to as high as 40 knots there. Otherwise, we're going to see winds at 20 knots or lower throughout mainland Alaska and the Panhandle. Down at 3,000 feet, pretty weak winds throughout the Panhandle area and all of the mainland, up to as high as 20 knots just off the Arctic coastline out of a westerly direction, but otherwise the strongest winds are going to be out by the Aleutian Islands with our low that's just to the south of the central Aleutians. Winds up to as high as 65 knots out of a southeasterly direction for the central Aleutians, dropping down to 40 knots by the western Aleutians, and 40 knots also for the Alaska Peninsula out of a southerly direction. As we move up into the central portions of the Bering Sea, you're going to see some easterly winds up to as high as 45 knots. And down in our turbulence, all associated with the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, from that low coming up below 3,000 feet for the western locations, and then below 4,000 feet as we get closer towards the Alaska Peninsula.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles in nests to respond to conservation measures. but threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected and the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and they'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. Starting off with a quick look at the ice edge. We do have ice along much of the Arctic coastline, as well as some of the eastern portions of the Kotzebue Sound area and the northeastern portions of the Norton Sound area. We have cold enough temperatures for some more expansion of the ice edge. However, some of the winds are slowing that down somewhat. So we would expect over the next several days after the winds calm down that we could have some more growth. And there is the possibility that within the next week, the Beaufort could be closed off from sea ice. Taking a look now in southeast Alaska for Thursday in the inside waters. We have northerly winds 10 knots in Lynn Canal, central areas southeast 15, and then in southern areas northerly winds 15 knots. Out over the Gulf waters in the eastern portions, north to northwest winds 15 knots, becoming more westerly as we get further to the north, 10 to 15 knots there. On Friday in southeast in the inside waters, southerly winds 25 knots expected in central and northern locations, and then at southeast 20 in southern locations. Out over the Gulf waters in the east, south to southwest winds 20 knots, and then as we move up north, southerly winds 20 to 30 knots expected. Out over south central waters on Thursday in the Gulf, we'll start off with west to northwest winds 15 knots, and then in western portions, northwest winds 20 knots. That's going to be on both sides of the Barren Islands. In Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 knots, and northwest winds 15 in the Prince William Sound area. On Friday, out over the Gulf waters, northerly winds 20 to 25 knots in western locations. In the North Gulf, we have a mixture of northwest winds 20 knots becoming easterly 20 as we move further to the east. In Prince William Sound, northerly winds 25 knots. In Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And then west of the Barren Islands, northerly winds at 30 knots with seas up to as high as 12 feet. For Thursday in the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, around Kodiak Island, west to northwest winds 15 knots, becoming 10 knots out of the west as we move further to the southwest. And then as we get closer towards Sandpoint, we're going to see southeasterly winds at 25 knots out ahead of that next front. On the Bering side, we're going to see easterly winds at 10 knots in Bristol Bay, getting up to as high as 30 knots as we move further to the west. On Friday, out by Kodiak Island, northeast winds at 35 to 40 knots, with seas up to as high as 16 feet through Shelikof Strait. In the Bristol Bay area, northeast winds 40 knots. That's going to be true throughout the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula, with seas up to as high as 17 feet as we get closer towards Cold Bay. On the Pacific side, southerly winds 20 knots with seas up to 21 feet south of Sandpoint. And then winds are going to increase out of the southeast 35 knots as we move closer to Kodiak Island with seas up to 13 feet. For the Aleutian Islands on Thursday out by the eastern Aleutians, east to southeast winds 35 knots, getting up to as high as 45 knots out of that east to southeast direction for the central Aleutians, and then becoming more northerly as we get by the western Aleutian Islands, 45 to 50 knots, seas up to as high as 21 feet, highest on the Pacific side of the central Aleutians. On Friday, out by the western Aleutian Islands, northerly winds 25 to 40 knots, getting higher as we move further to the east. Central Aleutian Islands, northerly winds 45 to 50 knots, and then by the eastern Aleutians on the Bering side, northeast winds 50 knots, and on the Pacific side, easterly winds 35 knots. Seas up to as high as 28 feet, highest on the Bering side of the central and eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, north to northeast winds 15 knots up north, getting up to as high as 20 knots by Nunavik Island, 25 knots by St. Lawrence Island, and easterly winds 35 knots by the Pribilof Islands, with seas up to as high as 8 feet. On Friday, in the northern locations, northwest winds 15 knots, becoming northeasterly 30 to 40 knots by Nunavik Island, strongest on the southern side. St. Matthew Island, northerly winds 25 knots, and then by the Pribilof Islands, northeast winds 45 knots, with seas getting up to as high as 19 feet. Along the Arctic coastline, southwest winds 20 knots on Thursday, and then down the west coast of the state, west to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. On the southern side of the strait, we're going to see northerly winds 15 knots. And then on Friday, along the Arctic coastline, south to southwest winds at 15 to 20 knots. Along the west coast of the state, west to northwest winds 25 to 30 knots, seas getting up to as high as 11 feet coming in, where we do have that special weather statement out for elevated surf along the Chukchi Sea coastline. And then south of the Bering Strait, northwest winds 15 knots. Weather for tonight, we're going to have a system moving up from the North Pacific, bringing heavier rain to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with some stronger winds by the central Aleutians. Out over mainland Alaska, some fog over the Kuskokwim Delta, and then snow from the Norton Sound area up through the Arctic coastline, with some areas of fog out east. Fog around the northern part of Cook Inlet, as well as some showers along the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle area, with rain further towards the Gulf waters, and then snow further to the north. As we look into Thursday, going to continue to see strong winds and heavy rain out for the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula, with some snow up the west coast and along the Arctic coastline, as well as continued rain by the North Gulf Coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.